Hello, everybody. Welcome to my presentation. I'm Faisal Mukhtar, and I'm a faculty at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals. In this talk, I will show our recent work on simulation of hydraulic fracture experiments using 3D generalized or extended finite element methods and its extension to study the parametric influence in multiple fractures. This involves collaboration with Armando Duarte from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. It's a fact that opportunities for conventional resources are becoming limited to meeting demand in natural gas. As a result of that, the exploration of unconventional resources such as the shale gas has become popular nowadays. However, in order to extract these unconventional gases, the rock characteristics needs to be actually altered using techniques such as hydraulic fracturing. This requires pumping a pressurized fluid containing propellant in order to allow the formation of multiple fractures. The propellant prevents the fractures from closing so that the natural resources can flow easily and get extracted. The fracture clusters are created in stages in the field, but in a numerical setting, they are usually modeled as radial notches. Some challenges to the technology, however, still require further research and development. This includes possibility of unfavorable fractures that may hinder the full exploitation of the resources, where it has been reported that touchless fractures are estimated to produce about only 20 to 30% of the possible yield volume. There is also the issue of multiple fracture interactions that affect the pressure drop and possible rise in the production cost. We can also mention the subjectivity of numerical predictive tools that exist nowadays in reproducing the experimental observations, which remains an open problem. For that purpose, in this work, we aim to demonstrate the robustness of a 3D generalized or extended finite element method for hydraulic fracture propagation, and then its performance against experiments and its application to multiple interacting hydraulic fractures. I have organized my presentation to proceed in the indicated sequence, starting with the mathematics behind the problem, followed by overview of the GFEM for 3D fracture simulation, then validation with experiments for two types of materials, polymethyl methacrylate, abbreviated as PMMA, and a concrete material. Lastly, I will talk about the propagation mechanisms in multiple hydraulic fracture interactions that are studied parametrically. Due to the small scale yielding at the fracture front compared with the rock formation, 3D elasticity was used to model the rock deformation. And we used linear elastic relationship between the Cauchy stresses and strains in order to model the material behavior. Then Reynold's equation and lubrication theory were used to model the time-dependent fluid flow and pressure, where a highly nonlinear relationship exists between the fracture opening W and the flux Q. Here, we highlight some features contrasting the finite element method, the basic GFEM, and the present GFEM. The basic GFEM and the present GFEM, no doubt, succeed in resolving the shortcomings in the finite element method when it comes to fracture modeling. However, the present GFEM outperforms the basic one in many aspects. This includes mesh adaptivity and size, and the fact that the basic GFEM only allows the fracture to grow in discrete steps, that is, from one boundary of a 3D element to another. In other words, partial crack growth within an element is not allowed in the basic GFEM. On the contrary, as typically illustrated here, the use of singular enrichments aid in the partial crack growth within background 3D element in the present GFEM. In our formulation, we cast the GFEM shape function phi as a product of finite element shape function n and a generic enrichment function L, where the finite element shape function satisfies the partition of unity. Now, to select the enrichment functions, we use a priori knowledge of the solution of a particular problem. For example, in the case of fracture problems, instead of creating a mesh fitting the crack surface, we use enrichment functions that can mimic the solution behavior across the crack surface. In our case, we select the enrichment space to consist of the discontinuous Heaviside function for those elements that are cut by the fracture surface and singular functions for those elements cut by the fracture front. Where, as shown earlier, a typical 3D fracture model built with the singular enrichments around the fracture front is repeated here. We use the llmann's criterion to estimate the twisting and kinking angles of the fracture. In order to do that, we solve the nonlinear system of equations shown on the slide. We then use the linear elastic fracture mechanics along with Irwin criterion, where for the regularization of the Irwin criterion, we use the GD model which delineates the propagation behavior of a given front vertex into 3 possible zones, depending on the stress intensity factor. Delta A max appearing in this model is the maximum advancement size, which is prescribed usually on the vertex with the highest stress intensity factor, while alpha and beta are constants. A graphical illustration of the GD model is shown on the slide here. Details of the solution algorithms for the generated system of nonlinear equations are reported in these 3 references. And for simplicity, from now onwards, I may interchangeably use the terms XFEM with GFEM. The first benchmark for validating our model is the hydraulic fracture test on PMMA specimen by Jeffrey et al., where the specimen has an initial notch and is produced according to the dimensions as shown on the slide. The setup consists of a polyaxial loading frame, which allowed monitoring the fracture growth using a pair of digital video cameras. And then using an injection tube, a fluid of a given viscosity was pumped at a desired rate into the initial notch. This table summarizes the values of the external stresses and the injection fluid properties. Here we show the 3D discretization for the GFEM's model using a fairly coarse mesh, where the triangulation of the initial notch provides a convenient set of points at the crack front that helps in extracting the stress intensity factors. As shown on the rightmost figure, the fluid was discretized with more refinement in order to capture the steep pressure gradient near the fracture front. The couplement physics problem was solved and the stress intensity factors were extracted using the displacement correlation method. The propagation parameters used in the model included delta A max, alpha, and beta, with the values shown in this slide. The figure on the left shows the results of the GFEM simulation for the fracture length versus time, while the fracture opening history is shown in the second figure. The experimental results, as well as the 2D boundary element method BEM predictions from Jeffrey et al. Are also shown in these figures, where it can be noticed that the GFEM and the experimental results agree very well with each other, as well as with the predictions by the BEM. The reference for this experiment, however, reported that the BEM was not able to reproduce the experimental results until after they changed the material properties in their model. The superiority of our GFEM is therefore obvious because we did not change any property reported in the experiments, yet we obtained such good results. The photo on the left shows the experimental fracture propagation, while the figures on the right present the GFEM simulation of the same. The capability of adaptive mesh refinement is evident in the GFEM at a typical propagation stage of 165 seconds. This figure shows the injection pressure history of the problem, with the experiment shown in black, the boundary element method shown in orange color, and the GFEM results shown in blue. The original reference further mentioned that they modified the experimental pressure reading by subtracting the frictional loss from it before comparing with the BEM simulation. Therefore, what we are seeing on the slide here is not the actual initially measured value of the pressure reading. As a result, we say that the GFEM pressure prediction shown here should not be interpreted in the same way as the friction-modified experimental pressure plot. Notwithstanding, however, the GFEM indicates that the pressure drops with time, which is a logically expected behavior, contrary to remaining nearly constant, as shown in the 2 other predictions. Moreover, we believe that the injection system compliance is the more critical factor affecting the pressure history than the friction pressure drop that was subtracted by that reference. Interestingly, the modified experimental pressure and the GFEM pressure prediction agree with one another at the later time of the propagation, that's towards the last 20 seconds of the hydraulic fracturing. And this is expected because it's a proof of the injection system compressibility effect, which diminishes with time, making the flow rate approaches a value that is similar to the one reported in the reference. Now, hydraulic fracture deviations from the wellbore arise in many situations during the fracking. The consequence of this is that it manifests in complex fracture path due to the mixed mode stresses. And this may hinder the resource extraction efficiency as well as clogging of the pathways by the propant. Hence, in my presentation, second validation problem that I will be talking about now consists of a series of mixed mode hydraulic fracture problems in a concrete material that were tested by Schwarzkopf et al. The design concrete properties shown in this table were tailored to represent those of a granite formation that's commonly encountered in the field. And the test consists of a cylindrical specimen with borehole and inclined initial fracture discontinuities illustrated in the figure shown on the slide. Here is a typical transversely cut specimen showing the internal details of the initial fracture and the borehole. And then shown in the third figure is an injection tube, which is embedded inside the specimen, and it allowed transferring the fluid to the inclined circular fracture. Next, a triaxial cell, which is shown in the rightmost figure, was used to subject the specimen to a set of externally applied axial stress and confining pressure. This was followed by using a high-pressure syringe, which was actually used to pump the fluid into the fracture. At the end of the test, the specimen was cut into two halves, and one half was used to digitize the propagated fracture surface using photogrammetry. The two blue and yellow colored surfaces are typical examples of such reconstructed fracture surfaces, which show evidence of mixed mode fracture propagation. We selected 4 of the tested specimens with parameters shown in this table, including the specimen ID, the angle of inclination of the initial fracture, the lateral confining pressure, and the axial stress. Using our GFEM, we modeled this set of experiments. This 3D background mesh was used for all the simulated cases without having to create a separate one for each case. And this is nothing but a benefit of eliminating the need for a mesh that fits the initial crack surface. Due to the symmetry of the problem, only half of the geometry was modeled. Typical instances of the fracture propagation simulated using the GFEM for specimen N27 are shown on the right of the slide. And the expected fracture behavior that realized itself in order to become perpendicular to the direction of maximum principal stress is evident in these figures. The photos on the left show the tested specimen N07, and its reconstructed fracture path at the end of the experiment is shown in different orientations in the top right view of the slide here. Then prediction by another finite element implementation in Frank 3D by the original reference is shown in the middle row of the group of figures appearing on the right. Our GFEM prediction of the fracture path is shown at the bottom, where here we show the full geometry of the fracture by mirroring it along the plane of symmetry. Both predictions by the GFEM and the Frank 3D seem to capture well the experimental fracture and shape. Each of the graphs in this slide corresponds to the fracture geometry of one of the 4 tested specimens which are simulated in this work. Predictions by the GFEM simulation are shown in blue and orange for the left and right wings of the fracture respectively, while the continuous orange and red lines represent the left and right wings of the experimental fracture respectively. Then the black continuous line represents the average of the 2 experimental fracture wings. It's evident that good correlation exists between the GFEM simulation and the experiment, with the GFEM prediction falling within the experimental envelopes. Varying degrees of fracture turning can be observed in these figures, with specimen N23 shown in part D of these figures portraying the sharpest turn, while specimen N08 shown in part C has the least turn but steepest fracture profile. And this was explained in the original reference, where it was attributed to the shear stress value on the fracture plane, assuming intact specimen, that is, a specimen without initial fracture and borehole. And it can be concluded from these figures that increase in the nominal shear stress results in sharper turn in the fracture, and hence subsequent flatter fracture path. This information can help in optimizing the resource extraction by minimizing the propant clogging due to sharp fracture turns. The last segment of my discussion pertains to the interactions between multiple hydraulic fractures. For all the multiple hydraulic fracture simulations, we adopted the same background mesh as typically shown here for 2 cases of remote stresses, that is isotropic versus anisotropic ones. We start with 2 misaligned fractures with their triangulation and corresponding fluid discretization shown in this slide. Running the simulation with low viscosity of 1 centipoise under the isotropic stress of 1 megapascal resulted in the fracture trajectories as shown here, where we can notice that after about 15 seconds, the 2 fractures avoid each other's domain of influence, thereby implying the prominence of the stress shadowing effect while injecting low viscosity fluid. On the other hand, propagating the 2 fractures with a higher viscosity fluid of 100 centipoise so the fronts of these fractures propagating more evenly as shown in the bottom figure. In addition, we notice more significant turning by the top inclined fracture towards the bottom horizontal one in the second case, more significantly than the one observed in the first case. It's noted that in both these figures, very smooth fracture surfaces were obtained via the GFEM simulation, and this requires fairly accurate stress intensity factors, thereby portraying the robustness of the extraction approach used in our model. Similar observations about the two viscosity cases in misaligned fractures have been reported in Castangier et al., with figures shown on the right. As expected, the viscosity of the injection fluid influences the breakdown pressure, the pressure history, and the opening displacement for the fractures. As shown in the left figure, the breakdown pressures appears to be 11 megapascal and 7 megapascal for the 100 centipoise viscosity and 1 centipoise respectively. The second figure shows the fracture opening at the injection points is larger in the case with high viscosity fluid. We now present another common scenario of multiple fracture interactions, naturally occurring arrays of echelon fractures. Here we show an illustration of the general physical features of any system of such fractures, where at the end we carried out the GFEM simulation of a typical case involving the indicator set of remote stresses for a series of 4 fractures. The resulting propagated fractures are shown here, where the mode mixity effect is seen to manifest as the fracture overlaps and then curves toward each other. The resulting fracture profiles can be seen to be similar to the typical field conditions shown on the right, which are case studies obtained from Wyoming and Dakota sandstones. In the end, we carried out one of the most rigorous parametric studies to understand the propagation mechanisms by varying the number of fractures, the spacing between them, the injection fluid viscosities, which include the low versus high viscosity, the remote stress type, including the isotropic versus anisotrophic type, as well as the fracture orientations, including upright versus inclined fractures. In our recent paper with reference details at the bottom, we saw various interaction behaviors, including changes in the speed of the propagations and different turning movements. This happened by mere changes in the combinations of the highlighted parameters. Also, varying effects of the injection pressure profiles and the fracture opening and so on were observed in the simulations. Such information can be useful for optimizing the treatment parameters, and due to the time constraints, they are not shown here, but the complete details can be found in the mentioned paper. To conclude, we succeeded in running simulations of hydraulic fracture propagation by developing robust 3D GFEM with computationally efficient implementation. We then validated the models using mode 1 hydraulic fracture experiments in PMMA and mixed mode crack trajectories in concrete. Then parametric studies in multiple interacting hydraulic fractures were conducted. We can say that the validation and the parametric studies can be used in optimizing the treatment parameters of hydraulic fractures. Finally, we extend our appreciation to the Deanship of Research at KFUPM for sponsoring this work. I thank the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for hosting me as a visiting scholar while conducting part of this research. We also acknowledge ExxonMobil as one of the earlier sponsors of the framework we use for the simulation. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and if you have any questions or comments, you can contact me at this email address. Thank you very much for your attention.